Hey guys, welcome to Qoaching. At Qoaching, you're going to learn the latest technologies and how these technologies are going to be implemented in the real world. So, without wasting much time, let's get started.
If you haven't subscribed yet, click on the subscribe button to get the latest updates from Qoaching. Hurry up, don't miss it.
Alright, guys, let's dive into Docker. Now, before we get into Docker, let me give you a brief how Docker was really started. Docker was started by a company called as dotcloud in the year 2010 as an open source project. Within the year of launch, Docker became so big that dotcloud has to shut down its operation and they have to launch a new company called as Docker Inc. Now, the container hype that we see today was all brought to us by Docker. Most of the companies that we see today, which are currently running their server based application on a virtual machine, are moving to a container based deployment. And that is all because of Docker. Now, 2014, Docker 1.0 was launched and the world became crazy. Since then, Docker has been evolving. Majority of the industry is adopting Docker and specifically the container based environment. That is what Docker is all about. So let's see how do we install Docker on our machine and get started with it. All right, let's get right into Docker. Now, before we get into Docker, we really need to have Docker installed on our machines. And in this video, I'm going to tell you which Docker edition you have to put on your machine. Now, we're going to go through that real quick and see what versions of Docker are there. Basically, we have dozens of Docker versions available right now in different flavors from different operating systems. So in this tutorial, I'm going to tell you what kind of Docker versions are there, what editions are there, why they exist, and which one suits you the best. And for the demonstration in this tutorial, we will see the installation of Linux and we'll try to install the Windows as well. Now let's try and understand how Docker is actually changing the world. It is very important for all of us to understand what Docker brings, what kind of capabilities Docker has. Now, since the time Docker has launched, we have seen a huge shift in the ecosystem. I mean, if you talk about an aspect, I want to say that we have a huge shift from the infrastructure into a Docker era. Now, it is very important for you to learn Docker in this era, regardless of what job profile you are in. If you're in the IT, you need to know Docker. Whether you are an operator or an engineer or a developer or a system admin, it does not matter. Docker exists for all of us and it's really important for all of us to know why Docker really matters. Now, to understand the shift that Docker has seen, let's kind of understand. I mean, if you go back to the era of 90s, we had these mainframe PCs, and then we saw a shift from mainframe to the PCs, and then we moved from there to the internet, where we had this network cablings and everything. Then we moved to the era of where we had these Mac and Windows, and if you remember, we had these Ethernet cables where TCP/IP was happening, and everything was shifting across the period. It took years, but I mean, if you see just 10 years ago, we were changing again, that we got data centers and the servers, and then we were changing again and we moved into virtualization. And now we started seeing a lot of, you can say, OSs being created in a piece of hardware, and that was all about virtualization. Now, we all use PCs on a daily basis. That's what our life is all about. Now, if you see within few years, if you see last, I would say 8 years, we saw an existence of the cloud computing, and that's where it all started, and that's where we all see that the cloud has evolved and the virtualization became more about on demand, and it was not about that we have to really rent a piece of hardware to kind of do our jobs. So Docker in the market is a part of that wave, and in that aspect Docker makes the IT world really strong. And now we are in the next wave, which is containers. Now, containers will also include down the line in a list of servers or functions or as a service. If you have heard about AWS or any cloud, you will understand the function as a service term, and we'll create some few more videos down the line to kind of talk about that. So Docker has seen that shift across the ecosystem. Docker is there to stay for a very, very long time. Now, wanting to understand that Docker was actually created uh, by keeping the developers in mind, which means that they work as well good as with the developers as they with any other sysop operators or admins or anyone for that matter. Now, the problem in the previous versions of app deployment is that all these individuals or teams like the sysadmins or the developers, they had to work in pieces, and what works on someone else's machine was not supposed to be work on other machines because of the environment mismatch or the configuration issues or any of these things. And that's why Docker is here. Docker is a container platform that regardless of what environment you're running into it is going to work in the same way. Now, it is very important to understand Docker is all about containers. When I say containers, that means they're not just some virtual machines. Docker containers are a self-isolated environment where you can run any application regardless of what environment they are in just by a small Docker command, and you can kind of put all those configuration in a file which we call as Docker file, which basically creates a Docker image, and then you run a container based on an image regardless of you're running in a production environment or a developer environment or a testing environment. Docker makes it all very easy for you. Docker is the result of the infrastructure shift that we just discussed from the mainframe PCs to the containers. You can see the kind of shift we all have seen across the generations and years, and how the next, I would say 20 years or more than that, is going to be all about containers. Now you might see this a lot of places that containers are the most, or you can say the fastest growing technologies on the planet. I mean, there have been so many articles and quotes regarding from the Gartners also that yes, containers indeed are the most challenging and promising and the fastest growing technology in the current scenarios. Now, what makes Docker special? Yes, that's speed. The way you can deploy a Docker container is so fast that it takes just few seconds to actually run a container as compared to a virtual machine, which might take few minutes in order to fire up, and then you have to set up everything. I mean, there are so many complications while running a virtual machine, but when you run a Docker container, it's all about ease. You can run a container in the span of a few seconds from an image. You can change the image that you wanted and then rerun the container. So everything is going to be the way you actually planned it. And that's why Docker is all about speed. I mean, there are a few companies who have really tested Docker, and few of them is PayPal and MetLife, where PayPal has basically transformed hundreds of their applications from a VM environment to a container-based environment. And that's what Docker is all about. And that's why Docker is so special, that every major IT company in the world is actually taking Docker to give a serious consideration and try and migrate their current infrastructure to be Docker ready.
Alright guys, so finally we have reached a step where I'm going to tell you how to install Docker on Windows or a Linux machine. I will also demonstrate you how you can download Docker for the Mac. So the very first thing we are going to do is we are going to install Docker for the Windows, and in order to do that we need to actually go to hub.docker.com. That's the Docker Hub website that we need to really get ourselves in, and this is where we can actually download the Docker for Windows or Mac. For Linux it's a pretty different process, but I will teach you how to do that. So when you open hub.docker.com, you will see a window of Docker Hub, and in order to do that you can either sign up for an account, because Docker needs you to sign in order to download the Docker for Windows. So I already have an account, so I'm going to go ahead and sign in. And once you go on the Docker, you will just put in your username and password. In order to do that, so I already have my username and password there, so I'm going to right away go ahead and sign in. And once that is done, you will be logged in and you will see certain options about Docker, and these are some repositories, like you have the GitHub repositories, we have the Docker Hub where you actually store your Docker images, and we will talk about these things in the future tutorials. So right now, in order for me to figure out where is my Docker for Windows, I will click on Explore. And once you do that, you will find certain options here. And as I said at the start, we are going to use the Docker Community Edition, so we will click on the Docker CE for that. And you can scroll down, you can see that we have Docker for Mac and Docker for AWS, for Fedora, for CentOS, and for us, we need to install Docker for Windows. So what we're going to do, we will click on Docker for Windows for that purpose. And once it's done, we will go here and see and click on Get Docker. Now, one thing I really want to point out here is that you should read this line that Docker is available only for Windows 10 Professional or Enterprise. That means if you are on a Windows 10 Home, let's say, then Docker for Windows, the desktop version, will not work for you, and I will show you what is going to work for you in that scenario. So let's download Docker from here and click Get Docker. Now, it's about a gigabyte of file, if I am correct, if I am right. Let's see. You can see it's close to 900 megabytes of file, so it's going to take some time to download. So let it download and then we'll install it. Alright, so we have now Docker downloaded in our machine, and let's install that. So it's a pretty traditional Windows installation on the Docker. So I've just opened the Docker desktop installer.exe. So once it's installed, you will see that Docker desktop will start downloading some packages in order to make sure it has the latest libraries to be installed. So it's going to take some moment to get this done. Now, as soon as it gets done, it will ask you whether you want to enable the required Windows feature, and this is the option 3. This is really important, guys. Now, Docker by default was designed for the Linux containers. It was never designed for the Windows, but the Docker desktop Windows version allows you to have the Windows container option, but I would always recommend you not to change from the Linux container, because Docker was designed for natively for the Linux container. So let's try and stick to the Linux version itself. So you click OK, and you will see the Docker will start installing, and it'll take some time to install it. And it's just going to unpack all the files. And one thing to understand about Docker also, those who have never used virtualization on their machines or never installed anything, that when Docker desktop runs, it will actually leverage your local Hyper-V settings or any virtualization setting in order to do that. And most of the laptops or the desktop that you have, you can actually enable the virtualization from the BIOS itself. You can go in and enable the virtualization technology from the BIOS if it's not there, because Docker would need in order to run that, because Docker is going to run a VM at the backend in order to run the Docker desktop. Because as I said, Docker is traditionally was designed for the Linux ecosystem, not the Windows. So in order to do that, you need to have the virtualization enabled on your laptop or desktop that you are going to use for Docker Windows installation. Now this process will take about a minute or two depending upon the kind of configuration your machine has it, and so we gotta wait for that until it asks you to basically restart your computer, and then the Docker will actually start once your computer is started. As you can see that Docker is installed successfully, and in order to complete the installation we are required to restart a machine. So let's do that. Okay, so now we have restarted our computer and the Docker is successfully up and running. And if you go at the taskbar, you can actually click on about Docker desktop to see what Docker is there. So you can see that my Docker desktop community version is up and running, and it's running the latest Docker engine 19.03, the Compose 1.25, and the other settings that you can see. The Kubernetes version is also mentioned there. So this is where you can see that we can install Docker, and there are a few more settings I'd like to show you. You can click on the Docker settings, and then you can see we have Docker settings here where you can see the Docker, how you want to install, how do you want to run the Docker when it starts. So I don't want to run Docker, let's say at the start of the Docker. When you log in, you can see there, you can look at the resources, the amount of resources right now allocated to Docker. You can see the Docker engine which is running, which is the Docker core, and some command line stuff. If you want to, you can actually enable that, and that's for purpose. You can see if you want to enable Kubernetes, which is how do we manage the containers in Docker. So that's pretty much on how Docker really works, and you can actually go ahead and kind of click cancel. You can see we don't have any containers running, and the easiest way to actually do this is to open PowerShell for that matter. So we will open PowerShell in the administrator mode, and you will see that we have Docker running. We can just run a quick small command, which is Docker version, and you can see that we have a Docker Community Edition version installed on our machine. So that is how we install Docker on Windows, specifically the machines which are Windows Professional and Windows Enterprise. Now, those who do not have Windows Professional Enterprise, there's another option which is Docker Toolbox, and we'll now see that how to install that. Okay, so now we need to understand how do we install Docker for the machines which does not have Docker Professional or Docker Enterprise. Now to do that, we will again go back to this Explore option, and we will go to Docker Community Edition and scroll to Docker Desktop for Windows. And here you will see that it says that for previous versions, get Docker Toolbox. So we'll click on Docker Toolbox, and this is what something that people who do not have the Windows Professional or the Enterprise, they can actually use the Docker Toolbox. So it's pretty simple. We can go here and we can find Docker Toolbox for Windows to install. We can click in here, and it will actually going to download a small file for us. So you can just look at the settings, how these looks like for you. So we will come back and come down here, and we will go to releases, and it says to download the Docker Toolbox, and you will see the latest release is 19.03, which sounds pretty okay. And you can see that is a .exe file. And just to give a heads up for people who are on Mac also, that hey, you can install Docker Toolbox for Mac also from here. You can download the .pkg file and install Docker Toolbox on the Mac. So this process is pretty same for those who want to install it. So we'll click on Docker Toolbox here, and it's a 231 meg file, so it's going to take some time to download. So that's going to happen. So let's kind of download it with my manager. Now, meanwhile it's downloading, I want to tell you something, because Docker, as I said, Docker was natively built for Linux, and since Docker Desktop is only available for Professional Enterprise, those who do not have this, they have to install Toolbox. Now, what Toolbox does is basically install the virtual box at the back end, and then run a Linux machine on the top of it, and then run Docker on that Linux machine, and then you can access that. So you can see what basically Toolbox is doing on your Windows is installing VirtualBox, then installing a Linux on top of that, and then install Docker in that Linux machine. So basically, you are actually running Docker on a Linux on a Windows virtual machine. So you can see that how you can run Docker on a native Windows machine which is not Professional Enterprise Edition, and we'll see that in some time how it actually really works. Okay, so I have downloaded a Docker Toolbox on my local machine, so I'm going to open the setup. Again, it's going to be a pretty traditional Windows setup that we are going to run, and whilst opening, you see that I said that the Docker Toolbox install the VirtualBox at the back, and then it's boot to Docker ISO, which is basically a Linux image which it actually installed in order to have Docker running for the machines which do not support the Docker Community Edition or the Enterprise, because of the Professional Enterprise of Windows version is only supported. So once you run Docker Toolbox, it's a pretty traditional Windows installation. So we're going to just click on next. I have Git for Windows already, so I'm not going to install that. If you don't have it, you can actually install it from here. To install everything, just keep the basic settings, and you will see that it installs docker.exe. Now what's happening here right now, guys, is that it's installing Docker Compose and another Docker specific libraries, and also it's going to install VirtualBox in my machine. and that's what it's going to happen at the back end. So we'll see that how this works once it's installed and complete the installation process. As you can see now, it is installing the VirtualBox as I said, so it will install VirtualBox to run Docker on the Windows. Okay, so the installation is successfully done, and let's run the Docker. Okay, so we have seen how Docker is installed on Windows operating system, and now we're going to install Docker on our Ubuntu machine, a Linux machine, which is the most preferred way of running Docker. I mean, most of the IT administrators or system admins, they all run Docker on a Linux machine. So let's see how that really operates. Now, in order to do that, I will actually go ahead and open my Git bash where I will actually log into my machine. So let's do that. And I have my terminal here. So what I'm going to do is basically, so just to give you a heads up, I'm running this Linux on an AWS machine, which is a cloud provider. And in order to do that, I need to basically locate my key by which I will be running this Docker machine. So let me do that. So now I'm going to log in into my machine, and that's a pretty straightforward process. And you can see I'm in a Linux machine. So the very first thing I will do is, just update this machine to the latest Ubuntu update. So we'll do a sudo apt get update, and you see it will take a few seconds to do the updates done. Now guys, installing Docker on the Linux is very, very easy. Now to do that, what we are going to do is we are going to actually go to a URL called as get.docker.com. Now this URL is where you will actually specify on how these things are going to be really operate. So get.docker.com is where you have to really go and find that specific URL. Now you see that it says that it's a pretty simple script. You have to just run a script and we will have Docker up and running on our machine, and the script is going to download a small script file from the docker.com, and then we'll run the script. So let's do that. The very first thing, we will copy this script here and then go to our Linux machine and just paste it. So we do that, and once we are done with that, we are just going to run the script. So we will do that too, and we will run that script. Let's make sure we run it with sudo so we don't have any problem. And you will see in a matter of just, I would say, a few seconds, you will see Docker installed and up and running in a Linux machine. And you can see that this is the easiest way of running Docker on Linux, and the most preferred way of running Docker in any environment for that matter. It will take a few seconds to install Docker here, and we'll be seeing it up and running any moment now. As you can see also that this is installing the Docker Community Edition version, which is the free version that we have already discussed. So even the script is installing the Docker Community Edition for us. And you see that we have Docker installed in our machine, which is the latest version 19.03. So we can just quickly check that to do that. Now, one thing which Docker requires is that because Docker itself creates a user, so we need to in order for running any Docker command, it requires the sudo permissions. So for us, we need to add our user to the user mod. So what we'll do, we'll run this command sudo user mod. As you can see, it's already mentioned above, -aj and Docker, and then my user, which is Ubuntu in this case. Oops, sorry. And that's it. And now it's there. So if we go ahead and do a clear screen and do a Docker version, you will see that we have a Docker up and running here. So you can just do a sudo here before that too, just to get more detail. You can see we have Docker up and running in the shrine, and I can run a command, for example, Docker container, just to show you, run, let's say, I want to run an Nginx, and this is something, if you don't understand, that's all right. Let's do a sudo again, and you can see that this is now Docker is pulling the Nginx container image for me. So you can see that we have got this image running, and if I can go to this IP address of this machine, you will see an Nginx container running. So let me show that to you now. If I go to my browser now and put in the IP address, you will see, guys, that we have an Nginx container running on this Docker. So it was so easy for me to run Nginx using Docker container, and that's what we have been talking about. So if I press a Control C, and you can see the moment I ran a container, it gave me some log from where it was running. So if I just do a Control C and go back here and do this, you will see it's not running anymore. But if I go and run that command again, you will see that it's going to run the Nginx container again for me, and there we go. So that was all about how to install Docker on a Linux machine, and this will bring us to the end of this tutorial. And thank you all for watching this tutorial. Please do subscribe to our channel and like and share this video, and we will be keep posting daily videos on different technologies. So thank you for watching again, guys. Have a great day.